Are we live?
All right. Yes.
We're live. There we go. I hit the table and like everything vibrated when we were live. That's cool.
Hello, Hacksters. Oh yeah. So this is Eben Upton of Raspberry Pi fame. How's it going, Eben?
It's going well. I am, as I said, not refreshing CNN at all.
Yeah. It's
no F5. No F5 for me today.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience, by the way. A little bit of technical difficulties, but yeah, let's jump right in. Okay, so we have this wonderful new thing, the Pi 400, Raspberry Pi 400. And the name, I feel like I should say the whole thing, because that was a definite aesthetic choice on your part. Can you tell us more about that?
So Raspberry Pi 400 it's a nod to the 1980s, right? So when I was a kid, I had a machine called, I had a BBC Micro. Which I guess is the machine I talk about most. But after I had a BBC, I had a machine called an Amiga 600. And so there were lots of machines in the 1980s that seemed to have three-digit numbers, usually that ended with 0. The obvious ones, the Amiga 600, were the Amiga 500, Amiga 600, the Atari ST 520, Atari 400 is quite popular in the US, I guess, but not so much over here in the UK. So it's kind of a nod to some of those people. A number of people thought it was explicitly an Atari 400 reference, but it's not. It's just sort of a general reference to that.
Right, because this is the Pi 4, but in a keyboard form, and you've been talking about how you might do like a Raspberry Pi 5 in the future.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, the nice thing is it's an extensible naming convention, right? So you can generate a Pi and a keyboard name from any version of the Raspberry Pi. There was, in fact, a 300 plus that was never. There was a prototype. Simon did a prototype based on the Pi 3 silicon that didn't launch. And so you have 300 plus, 400 plus, 500. And there's always kind of a rule where if you're a beginner and you don't know anything about Raspberry Pi, the right thing to do is always to just pick the biggest number. And this preserves the pick the biggest number property, which is quite nice.
Oh, splendid. So a word about what we're actually talking about here. We've got the Pi 400 here in the studio. And this one I've actually sort of taken apart because it's got some cool new features. So it looks exactly like the old keyboard on the outside, except for these ports, which of course you've got a security port, you've got Ethernet, 3 USB ports, 2 USB 3, 1 USB 2, your power, a couple of HDMI outs, SD card, micro SD card, and your standard 40-pin connector. But what's inside, I think, is one of the most exciting things, is this giant heatsink out of nowhere.
All the metal. We have all the aluminum.
Yeah, so what's this
there you go. See, I localized my...
Aluminum. Oh, yes, not aluminium.
Aluminum. Aluminium. You pronounce it aluminium.
Indeed. So that is doing some pretty cool stuff, including aesthetics, obviously. It gives it a sort of heft that you've talked about very excitedly.
Yeah, I mean, weight, like density is a really... I remember being in a hotel ages ago now, like 10, 15 years ago, and they had a Bang & Olufsen television, and it had a remote control, and the remote control just felt so good that I had to take it apart. I had a screwdriver with me. I took it apart, and what you found was it was a regular remote control, but it had a billet of steel inside it to make it feel great,
Totally.
And even if that didn't need a big slug of aluminium in it, it would have been tempting to put a big slug of aluminium in there.
Totally, especially since you have sort of extra space often in things like that. Like this is pretty much the same size as the old keyboard. It just has this extra thing, and it's pretty.
It's about
thick.
a millimeter. So it's about a millimeter thicker. So I think the limiting factor was the Ethernet jack was accommodating the pitch of the keyboard. So you've got the Ethernet jack here, which is recessed. You can see it's recessed into the PCB to get the height down. And even though it's recessed into the PCB, I think, and you can see the cutout there actually for it, that it was hard to get the keyboard over the top of that. So, so I think the keyboard grew about a millimeter. And we got a little bit of a question in our minds at the moment as to whether we should backport the millimeter
to the previous version.
To the keyboard.
Right. That's what I meant. And I'm not going to pull the rest of this apart because I think that it seems to be attached to the heatsink or the thermal coupler to the.
Have you undone the screws?
I have.
Well, just yank it.
Oh, okay.
It's only,
I'm gonna yank it.
We'll send you another one if you break it. It's only
All right. Okay, so we've got this
it
cable that I'm. Oh, you just.
Oh yeah, be a bit careful with that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, so I'm gonna yank it. All right. Is there anything up here that is gonna?
I don't think so.
Okay,
I think you can just grab the bottom end and start levering it up.
I'll slide my little thingy under here that I used.
It's just gonna pull away from the. It's gonna pull away from the. From the CPU, it's just a double-sided bit of thermal.
I didn't know about this.
I think if you're going to ruin anything, it was when you pulled the.
Oh, there we go. Hey,
there you are. Thermal.
Exciting. Oh yeah, that foam tube stuff is amazing. I love it.
Yeah,
okay, cool. So there's your thermal coupling with the processor there. Wow, so cool.
It's neat, right? I mean, Simon's done a lovely job.
It's very cool, and there's no screws anywhere.
No, the whole thing is because it's assembled in the UK, so screwdriver time is precious. So it is designed with however many screws it was you had to undo. 2, is it? I think it was 2.
4, yeah.
4.
I think there were.
Yeah, 2 and a quarter.
Where exactly? It does make me think that if you had more screws, it would have more heft.
Yeah, that's it, right? We could just put a bag of screws in it. I saw someone. I saw a great. I think this one's quite famous. A USB SSD bought from AliExpress, which was it was actually just a USB flash drive inside a USB SSD case with some bolts, and it just had these kind of because it was like the only the cheapest metal they could get their hands on, and they just got like 4 big bolts and then some hot glue and put it inside the case, and they were like, this SSD seems quite slow.
Oh no! Yeah. Well, that's definitely.
But that PCB, so you see, it really is a Raspberry Pi 4.
Yeah,
but comes smeared out, you know.
And it's a different form factor, of course. People have talked about how, if you were to dig this out and try to put it in a regular project, that wouldn't really make sense for embedded stuff. Yeah. And so with the way that this is arranged, it does end up being a little bit harder with, for example, the 40-pin connector. If you have like a hat or something to attach things onto there and have it sort of work out. But that's sort of not what this is designed for, right? It's more of a sort of educational and corporate style consumer product.
Yeah, it's our first real consumer product. It's the first thing you could imagine buying in. Well, you can buy Raspberry Pis in Target and Best Buy. But it's the first one that you could imagine buying, say, in the consumer bit of a store like that, in the PC bit rather than in the maker bit. And of course you can with the 40-pin connector. The nice thing with the 40-pin connector is if you connect a hat to it, the hat does at least, you can just plug a hat in and it does at least stick up. So it sticks up, but the top of it faces backwards. But what you can do is you can get a little female to male IDC40 ribbon cable, and they do exist. They're sort of about that long. And if you plug that in, what you find is that like this, it sits on top of the hat sits the right way round on top of the ribbon cable behind your device, and that works really nicely.
Yeah, and there's some other adapters we've been seeing suggested as well, like this Fat Stack kit or Adafruit's Pi Cobbler, things like that would help you.
Yeah, they work really well.
And of course, you can use pinout.xyz to see how things would fit together and sort of design your thing around that. Another cool thing this comes with is there is a beautiful, if you get the whole kit, the $100 kit. Oh, let me change this. At least in the US, so it's $70 for the computer itself in the keyboard form factor. And then you also get, among other peripherals and things, mouse, charger, things like that. You also get this beautiful book. And
it is a measure of how last minute everything came together at the last minute. You have the third edition of the book, which has no Pi 400 content in it. So there is a fourth edition of the book, which has a very conspicuous Pi 400 on the front cover and little breakouts, because that talks a lot about how you configure a conventional Raspberry Pi 4. It's really important to us to have we try to be good at everything. We try, but it's like, it would suck if we were good at making computers, but terrible at writing documentation. And so a lot of effort has gone into making sure that the collateral around the device is as good as the device itself. And we're really proud of that. I mean, that's Gareth Harpercree, who I've known for a very long time. He and I wrote the Wiley Beginner's Guide, the Wiley User Guide together. And then he wrote that for us. He's an amazing guy.
Yeah, he wrote our guide to the Pi 400, in fact. Yeah.
There he is.
I learned a lot from this.
He lives about 10 miles from where I grew up in Bradford, and he's
no way.
Amazing. He's an amazing guy.
Cool. I wanted to point out the fact that there is this Sense Hat content in here, and this does seem like something that I would actually fit pretty well onto here. Some other ones, like I was messing around with the bare conductive touch board, and it's got like a little thing on the side here that sort of overlaps with a couple of the ports. So it's something to keep in mind if you're looking to design like peripherals for this in the future. Do you think that we'll see additional hats and things that will be designed sort of the opposite, so that they face you when you plug them into the Pi 400?
Yeah, it's quite a nice idea, isn't it? Because of course, there are echoes. This design has lots of echoes, not just the number. Has lots of echoes of the 1980s in it. It
reminds me of this guy.
Yeah, there you are. You see, so we wondered about shipping it with some blue tack. Wow! And that's actually a ZX81, not a Sinclair. That's not a Sinclair Timex 1000. You're in America, and you have a British ZX81. That's very cool.
This is from my father, who lived in Britain for a long, long time.
Very cool. So I had one of those when I was a kid. I was given it by a friend, and I could never get it to work.
And this is 16K of RAM. I've never gotten this to work either, but like, it's cool,
it just looks amazing. It looks amazing, though, right? And the funny thing is, and of course, the famous problem with that device is when you press, if you type in 16K of basic and then you press save just too hard, then it jolts the RAM pack and resets.
Oh, no.
So that's the blue tack. So there's a tendency to put blue tack. That's what the blue tack. And it was very tempting to ship some blue tack in, but just a little square of blue tack in the box just for old time's sake.
That's hilarious.
But so you kind of imagine that there might be a world of, little LCD that peeks up, a backwards hat with a little LCD that peeks up behind.
Absolutely. Nice, and then, especially with a little screen on it,
Yeah, right. My father had a machine when I was a kid called an Apricot Zen, which was a PC. It was a vaguely IBM compatible PC, and it was largely a piece of garbage. But the cool thing that it had was that it had it had the function keys, 10, 12 function keys, but then it had 6 soft function keys and had a little 2-line LCD display above the function keys, and you could label the function keys. And he had this because he's a linguist, and he had a special word processor that had a lot of different fonts for doing the kind of linguistic markup for dictionaries. And you could select between them, and this was like a context-sensitive little menu. So, I like that idea now.
That's super cool.
Someone make that. Quickly.
Sweet. One thing that it makes me think of here, let me change over to the keyboard, is that for the first time, you have a built-in sort of power key on here, which is you hit function, and you can do F10, and then it'll do a nice soft shutdown for you. That's beautiful. Yeah,
to a really low power state as well. So the when you're in the shutdown state, the PMIC is powered off. So the actual the PMIC in there that generates it was right 3v3, 1v8, 1v2, and 1 volt. 4 of the 5 rails in the device, and that PMIC is actually powered down by the keyboard controller. So there's a Holtec USB keyboard controller in there, and that's powered down when you are in that low power state. So it's very, 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 compared to the powered down state of the 4, very, very low power consumption.
Even the keyboard, that's incredible.
That's cool.
I wanted to ask you about maybe some future plans, because one thing that's going on here is that, let me pull this up. You have 3 USB ports instead of the standard 4 from the past. And one thing that I noticed is that on the old keyboard, or on the keyboard, the existing keyboard, you've got built-in USB ports, which made it really easy to plug in a mouse. And so since now I have to plug in the mouse separately, it seems that we've almost kind of lost a USB port since we have to still plug in the mouse. And I wonder if you have any plans, since this would be a sort of consumer product, to put, for example, a wireless mouse transceiver inside of it, and then you could have just like a little, your Raspberry mouse.
Well, of course, it has a wireless mouse. Oh, that's a nice idea. So you're thinking of kind of like 800 and some megahertz or 400 and some megahertz cheap wireless mouse. Of course, it has a wireless mouse transceiver because it has a Bluetooth radio. It has a Bluetooth radio, right? So if you want to attach a Bluetooth mouse to it, you can. That's an interesting thought, though. Actually, this is great. I'm just going to basically go away and implement the ideas you gave me on this call. But that's an interesting idea that you could put a low frequency ad hoc mouse interface in there.
Have you thought about making a wireless Raspberry Pi mouse?
Yes. But we haven't. Yes, but we haven't yet because
lots of things going on, huh?
Let's see. Think of all the different reasons. Batteries are scary. They are, right? I mean, you think about all the things we can do now at Raspberry Pi. We can make dual band wireless radios and keyboards and things. Batteries are still scary. So batteries are a bit scary. Sort of a general feeling of like wanting to do it with Bluetooth, but Bluetooth being a bit expensive. And so shying away from Bluetooth because it's a bit expensive, and not Bluetooth because you need to have the little dongle. Although I like the idea of building it into the keyboard. We should do it at some point, but it's never floated to the top of the list.
Absolutely.
I've kind of enjoyed the left-handedness hate. There's been there's been a lot of people saying, "Damn you! You put the ports on the left-hand side." And but it's like I'm not sure that being discriminated against for being right-handed is an actual problem in
the entire rest of the world is designed for right-handers.
Yeah, why not? Like Ned Flanders deserves a break, right? I reckon.
So for those wondering what that's about, it's that these USB ports are on the right side, or the left side, my bad, compared to the HDMI out and the power and things like that. So if you have it like this, and you have your mouse plugged in, and you have other stuff plugged in, I'm just going to go ahead and do that, then the mouse cable is going to go across your other wires. But honestly, is that big of a problem?
Yeah, I don't know. It really? It seems like, I think we sometimes discover that people want to be, a tiny subset of people want to be unhappy. And it's almost like this thing with, the thing with carpets, isn't there a thing with Islamic carpets where they always have a floor, like Middle Eastern carpets always have a floor in because only Allah is perfect?
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that.
And maybe it's that we should always put the little floor in just because, otherwise what will people be sad about?
Honestly, yeah. And that way you can be like, well, what do you want? It's always going to be that way, though. Okay, so
I use it every day, and I use it in there every day, and I've never noticed an issue. I've never really seen it as a problem.
I don't think so either. So yeah, there is no built-in camera port on here. We'll notice. I'm curious as to whether there is a USB webcam that you would recommend.
Yes. So we have a webcam, an A4. There's a company called A4 Tech in Taiwan who we do buy cameras from them, or we do offer them to our approved resellers. It's a really nice webcam. It looks very similar to the classic Microsoft. You remember there's a sort of a classic kind of a barrel-shaped Microsoft webcam.
Right.
It's not a Raspberry Pi product, but it's really nice. We do offer it through some of our approved resellers. It should work with any USB webcam, and that's kind of the pitch, right? Yeah, we looked at putting the camera interface on there. If you think about what people are going to use, particularly in the last 6 months, where there's been a big pivot towards using Raspberry Pi products as a way of studying from home.
Yeah,
working and studying from home. People need a microphone, and our camera doesn't have a microphone on it. So there was that feeling that, look, if you're going to want a thing which is a consumer-focused webcam, it's got a microphone on it, just go and buy one.
Yeah,
and they work pretty well.
I recommend the C920 from Logitech. It's what I've been using to Oh yeah, it's very.
So we have a
very
chap.
popular.
Do you know Alistair Allen?
Oh yeah.
You know Alistair, right? So he joined us. So he works for us now.
Oh cool.
Yeah, he joined us at the start of the year, and he has the most amazing webcam with this ring of LED.
Oh, I bet you he does.
It's like £100 webcam or something, and it's just it's great. That works well with the Pi as well.
I'll have to pester him for a recommendation.
Yeah, no, he's your man if you want the ultimate home working. You want the ultimate home. He wrote all of our tutorials for when the COVID thing kicked off. He wrote all of our tutorials for how you how to work from home using a Raspberry Pi 4 at the time. But obviously,
oh, fantastic. Yeah, and so now I can confirm, as I showed a second ago, that I've plugged it all back in again, and it does work. So you don't need to send me a new one.
Cool. See if it gets hot though. Maybe it gets really hot really quickly because the thermal pad is being misaligned or something. I don't know. It's possible.
Do you not trust my reassembly techniques, Evan?
I don't know. I've never taken one apart and put it back together again. So
okay, I'll see what happens. Yeah, it does have a lot of a huge vent on the bottom here, and I think it should be fine.
Yeah.
You mentioned using it for working from home and for studying and stuff, and it definitely seems to be designed well for that. You have a couple of things that you mentioned in your article with Gareth about, for example, using it in a corporate situation, like as a thin client for working with servers, such as with Citrix.
Yes. Yeah. So this is why does Raspberry Pi 4 have two display outputs? Because Citrix. So people have been using Raspberry Pi 3s in particular as Citrix thin clients, Citrix to run Citrix receiver for a long time. It's amazing how many customers in that space need two monitors. You would think, even what you would think would be a low-end deployment, like a bank call center, really needs two monitors because they want to have one monitor with your details on and one monitor with the product they're selling you on. Right? So, so you can only address a tiny fraction of that market with a single display output device. Unfortunately, that relationship with Citrix kicked off early enough that we were able to incorporate that feedback into the silicon design process for Raspberry Pi 4. And so we have that, and we really kind of, in my mind, this is the product, right? So if you are a corporate customer, if you're a corporation and you're setting out, you're doing a thin client deployment, I now really can't see any reason why it would make sense to use any device other than that one. We know it's going to drag us to the black and gray variant. The black and gray variant will always break our hearts. We know we'll be dragged to it eventually, and probably by corporate as much as something else.
That makes sense. And you also have a program called PiDrop, where, for example, lots of people stuck at home can't go to school and use the computers there. There's, you have to have your own sort of home computing setup often. And so this is also kind of designed for that. Can you tell us about PiDrop?
Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things about COVID is, I guess, that it showed up a bunch of inequalities in our society, structural inequalities in our society, which were always there and which we'd managed to ignore. One of them is that there were a vast number of people. We don't know about this all the time. One of my founding motivators for doing Raspberry Pi was I went to a bonfire night party. So November the 5th in the UK, we had bonfires and remember. 5th November, remind the government that they nearly got blown up. So I went to a bonfire night party with a bunch of friends from Broadcom. And there were some people there. There was a lady there. I got talking to her. She was saying how keen her son was. This was 15 years ago. She was saying how keen her son was on programming. God, he's probably 30 now, right? And how keen he was on computers. And I was like, oh, that's really great. Because I was even then very involved in computing education. And I said, and he came over and I said, what computer have you got? She said, I've got Nintendo Wii. And it was just a horrible crashing moment of realizing that you had somebody who had a passion for programming, apparently, or passion for computers. And what they had was a platform on which they could never, ever, they would never become anything. They There was no ladder from owning a Nintendo Wii to being a computer programmer. And so kind of Pi's always been about that. It's always been about providing general purpose computing capability, whether or not it's used for programming, to people who don't have any. And obviously, we were able to kind of ignore the fact that there were vast numbers of kids in the UK, I'm sure it's true in the US as well, who don't have access to computer hardware. Until we sent all our children home and said, hey, follow along at home using your computer. 700,000 children in the UK had no computer. So you have families with 2, 3, 4 kids. Maybe mom or dad has a smartphone, and that's it.
Yeah. And
good luck. And so a lot of what we've done, and Raspberry Pi has always been about, historically, it's been primarily about, if you think about computing education and computing for education, computing education is teaching people about computers. Computing for education is providing people with computers so that they can learn something else, French or English or art or something. And we've always been about the former and not so much about the latter. And one of the things that's happened this year is that we've really been pulled, I guess, towards the latter. And that's what PyDrop is about. So it's about taking a very small fraction, sadly, of the 700,000 children, or 700,000 families, and providing them through philanthropic funding with access to, well, at the time, Raspberry Pi 4, but I expect it'll be Raspberry Pi 400 for ongoing deployments, so that they can follow along at home. And of course, the nice thing there is you're giving them a device which maybe they see as a word processor, or they see as a thing for getting on a Teams call or a Zoom call. But it still ships with Python, and it still ships with the C compiler, and it still ships with that book. And so the you're kind of hoping to accomplish 2 things. One of them is to stop these people from falling behind in their general studies, and then the other one is to provide them with a platform. And this was the dream with Raspberry Pi, the sneaky platform. Like those 1980s machines, the 8-bit machines. They get into your life as a games machine, but they boot into BASIC. And we always talk about, that 2-line program, 10 print I am the best, 20 go to 10. Or 10 print something a lot filthier than that, 20 go to 10. And then you go into, and like everybody of my generation knew how to do this. And you go into Best Buy or Dixon's in the UK, and you type that into all the machines, and then you hit enter, run down the line, hit enter, run enter on all of them, and then run out, look through the window as the people in the shop gradually realize that every CRT in the place has something very rude on it, and pull the plugs out. We used to make our own entertainment, and that really is, so it's kind of like that. That's really important. The people have machines that have a ladder that they, even if 90% of people never climb the ladder, the fact the ladder's there ensures that some proportion of people will do that.
And in the book, you have stuff about programming with Scratch. You also have just recently released this book on Code the Classics, which is sort of exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's my baby, my other baby. I have actual babies, but this is so this was a long-standing thing. I mean, I'm sure you remember this from these things. So I'm sure you remember this from the 1980s. Though you probably don't, actually. But but anyway, you remember type-in listings books, right? They were a thing.
I remember seeing them, yeah.
Yeah, right. In museums, and so
my dad had an Amiga and stuff, so I remember. This
was the thing, right? Yeah, that's it. Right? But
Yeah.
This was the thing. So you'd have these books, and they had basic programs, and they were 15, 20 lines long. And you had to have a lot of imagination, because they'd be like, here's a simulation of skiing, or here's a simulation of fighting I think it had combat games, was one of those. Here's a simulation of flying a fighter plane, and it was a dot that flew across the screen. But you could type them in. I guess what we asked ourselves when we were doing that book was, and of course I made a rod for my own back, because that's just volume 1, and I'm supposed to kind of write a bunch of stuff for volume 2 now. But what would what would the ultimate type-in listings book look like now? We have these very powerful computers, and could you make a type-in listings book where the games you type in are competitive with casual games, mobile phone games? Could you keep the listings with plausibly short listings, and they really are too long to type in? You should really clone them off GitHub, because you get comments if you clone them off GitHub. But yeah, they are my constraint when I wrote them was to make them under 10K about 500 lines of Python and under 10K of fairly, not maximally minified Python, but fairly crunched up Python. Could I write? And there you are. So that's and each of them there are 5 games, and each of them is have an interview with some people who wrote a game in the 1980s, generally, or 90s, and then then you have a tribute version that we wrote. But the graphics, it's really nice. And so the games are Pong, Centipede, and that was the one I enjoyed. I loved writing Centipede.
Oh, cool.
Centipede. Bubble Bobble, which is the one that you showed there. Football of some sort, sensible soccer in our case, and Frogger. And so you have these games. So you have an interview, and then you have 5 chapters with an interview, and then a type of listing. And that was obviously good. And then we did the whole thing in really expensive paper with really high production values, and it's intended to be, what would those 1980s listings books have looked like if you were if they were designed to be coffee table books. They were designed to be pieces of art. And that's what we did with volume 1. I'm about halfway through writing the games for volume 2, but as I say, I have actual babies. So, I'm not making a huge amount of progress on volume 2, but there will be volume 2. And the games for that, I think we're probably going to do Defender. We'll do one of those kind of into the screen racing games, like kind of pole position. You'd like to relocate me?
I would, yes, because I have to put the children on the plane to have dinner.
Okay, I'm going to get relocated. I did say I had babies. Babies, apparently need the babies. This is the dining table. The babies need. Let me try and do the camera angle so you don't see any of the.
Okay.
Woo! That was Liz. Just.
I know that feeling. I've got a lot of That's over here. Here, I'll switch the view over to our.
There we are. That's good. There you are.
So, and this actually plays back into your existing, what you're talking about with design, right? So this, I'm amazed that this is only 12 pounds. That's ridiculous. But you've sort of said again that this is sort of the book that Ian Banks's The Culture series would give to their children to learn how to code.
Oh, yes.
Like that design.
Yeah, imagine. Yes, imagine. Sorry, I'm just trying to get some sort of vague semblance of light around me here, but. Various people wandering around.
No problem.
Yeah, so there's that idea that what is the kind of feel everything we make should be good. I think there's we just don't want to make we try to make the best thing we can on any given day. That isn't always the best thing that we would love to be able to make. But I don't think we've ever made a product of Raspberry Pi that we've been unhappy with within the constraints of the technology we have available to build it with on that day. We try to take that same ethos and apply it to the publications. So we publish a number of magazines, and we've really tried a number of which we've acquired. So we brought some magazines in. It's interesting if you watch what we do when we acquire a magazine, is to generally dial up the editorial budget.
Cool, yeah. And we have a question from someone that says, this is not a new idea. We had computers and keyboards back in the 80s and 90s. And of course, that's the entire point, kind of. I'm curious with your the heft of this one. How did you workshop that? Was it all just a design consideration for the heatsink that helps it go faster? The weight of it's entirely a design.
Okay. It's entirely. So it's a functionally driven thing, if you see what I mean. It isn't gratuitously heavy. It's heavy because it's as heavy as it needs to be to accomplish the aim.
Which is cool, so cool. You actually are able to speed it up from 1.5 gigahertz to 1.8 gigahertz, basically overclocking it because of this giant heatsink, and avoid all the thermal, slowing down problems that you had if you weren't using maybe a fan or a heatsink with a previous version. So cool.
Which of course we fixed.
Oh yes, of course.
So I think that's very important. I think it's very important to emphasize. I mean, there was an interesting thing we launched Raspberry Pi 4 is that there were a number of people who felt that it got rather hot, and of course it did get rather hot. But we had a plan to fix it, and the plan to fix it was to do a bunch of software work. And so there's Gareth actually has a fantastic series of article in the Magpie, which looks at the impact. I think he read in December of last year, so 6 months into the program, and it looks at the impact of 6 months of successive improvements to the firmware on thermals on both.
Oh, cool.
Unloaded thermals, where we went from about 3 and a bit watts of power consumption to about 2 watts of power consumption, and then loaded power consumption, so full tilt power consumption, where we went from a little over 7 watts to a little over 6 watts. And that obviously makes an enormous difference. The first one makes a big difference to the idle temperature of the device, and that's important because it determines almost every product that we own. Certainly every fanless product, so every mobile phone, say, is designed around a kind of a sprint model of performance. So it's designed around the idea that you have some thermal reserve. So the device sits at some temperature, and when it starts to work hard, that temperature is allowed to increase to a higher temperature. And then once it reaches that higher temperature, the device will throttle it or artificially reduce its performance in order to keep the temperature at that higher temperature level. And so the lower the idling temperature of the device, the more thermal, the more energy you can absorb for a given amount of thermal mass, the more temperature you can absorb. So idle current is important because it gives you more headroom during the sprint phase, and then obviously peak performance is important because it reduces the gradient, it reduces the rate in which you run up during the sprint phase. So we put a lot of effort into that, to the point where I can run if I have an uncased Pi 4, I can compile Linux flat. There we are. Oh, without a fan. I can compile Linux on 4 cores. So I do a -J4 build of the Linux kernel continuously without hitting the temperature limit. The temperature limit is 80 degrees. So we fixed that. We fixed those problems.
So cool.
If you overclock it to 1.8 gig, the problems come back.
So then
that's where the big piece of that's where you want that if on a Pi 4. That's where the big piece of aluminium in a Pi 400 is helpful. But it is important to emphasize, it's like the software team did an enormous amount of work and fought that down. And I think one of the problems was when we launched and we said to people, just wait, it's okay now. And it'll be great in 6 months. People kind of sometimes imagine that you are just saying that to get them to buy the Raspberry Pi. But I think we did deliver on it. And I think we all kind of always have done. The Raspberry Pi has always been the story about we try to ship products when they are good and then make them great subsequently through software. So the people who bought on launch, they don't feel aggrieved. If you try and fix it with hardware,
they get to have those.
You're not your early adopters, which is a bad idea.
Right. And Gareth notes in the article, like you were saying, that the function is really only needed on this one if you want, because the Pi 4 itself can be overclocked up to that 1.8 gigahertz, just like the Pi 400. If you have, for example, a heatsink or something, but you only need the heatsink or fan if you're trying to do the same kind of overclocking, like you said.
Yes.
So cool. That's wonderful. We have. Speaking of the retro computing, it makes me think of, we have this beautiful, wonderful, aesthetically pleasing keyboard. And I actually love how these keys feel on the new one as well. But I'm curious, given your retro aesthetics, have you ever thought about making a super clicky mechanical style keyboard?
I'd really love to. So I'm more than a retro geek. I'm a former IBM employee retro geek. Therefore, I have a great love of the buckling spring. Liz bought me one for my birthday a few years ago, and I then poured coffee into it. That buckling spring, the buckling spring microswitch keyboards that you would get with a PS2, with the early PS2 machines. Are amazing. I mean, they're an incredibly antisocial device to have in an office environment because they make this. But they are a really satisfying device. What I suspect we're going to find is people will take that. I expect people will find other uses for that, the motherboard out of a Pi 400. So if there isn't one in an IBM a keyboard within 5 minutes, I will be slightly amazed. But it's one of those ones where it's kind of we've always had to be a little bit careful about indulging our geekiness, I suppose, about indulging the things that we think would be cool. We have to try and do things that we think will be useful for the largest possible number of people, because ultimately, Raspberry Pi works because it works as a business because it satisfies people's needs at scale. And that's why you don't often see us making. We have from time to time made what we thought at the time, at least, were niche products. So the IR camera. So we make a version of each of our camera boards. We make a version of the camera board that doesn't have the IR cut filter. So the sensor tends to be sensitive in the near infrared.
I think it's really cool effects.
Yeah, but that was a niche. That was really niche because I think we had some people use it for plant science. They use it for plant health. The reflectance of plants in the near infrared is a interesting measure, I think, of whether they're in water stress. And so one or two people wrote to us and said, "Oh, I've been taking your camera modules and prizing them apart with a scalpel and taking the cut filter out." And so we thought, well, it costs us nothing to mail our supplier and say, just send us 1,000 that have glass, a passive blanker instead of a cut filter. Then it's a massive seller. It's incredibly popular. It's thousands and thousands and thousands of units a month. But we do occasionally make things just because we can. But we do have to be careful with something like this product that we try and hit the middle of the market.
Totally. And, that's where we come into questions like this, where it has, this is the 4 gig version. There isn't currently a 2 gig, 1 gig, 8 gig version. And presumably that comes down to just reducing the number of SKUs because you are a business. Would you say that?
Yeah, well, particularly this product that has, I think, a big change for us as a company in the last year or two has been that we have ended up with a number of products which are very SKU heavy. So Compute Module 4, which we launched a couple of weeks ago, has 32 SKUs because it has 4 densities, it has 4 flash densities, and it has wireless and non-wireless. So that's 32 SKUs for that product, which is, and the keyboard obviously has a SKU per language. If we were to do a black and grey one, that would double it. And then, of course, we could then multiply that by RAM SKUs. I don't think we'd ever do a 2 gig. Well, we don't do 1 gig product anymore. We do 1 gig module, but we don't, other than that, do 1 gig product. I don't think we'd ever do a 2 gig product because the cost delta between 2 gig and 4 gig is not really large enough to, when you have a product that has a keyboard in it, that kind of pushes the cost up because you've integrated that, it sort of dilutes. If you make small changes to the rest of the bill of materials, the kind of proportional change to the cost of the final product, it becomes smaller. It's the same absolute difference, but a smaller proportional difference. So I could imagine us doing 2 gig maybe for some, if you had a government contract to go address some of these 700,000 children, which we would love to do in the UK.
Right. But just like a ludicrous number of units.
If you had a ludicrous number and you multiply a few dollars by a ludicrous number, you end up with a material saving. Would we do an 8 gig version? We might do at some point. I think, again, it's about hitting the middle of the market. But certainly if you're running Raspberry Pi OS and doing relatively consumery things with it, 4 gig is plenty of memory. And so we thought, well, what should we do for the launch product? Let's try and make sure that people have a compelling, cost-effective product. Would we do 8 gig in the future? Well, 8 gig Raspberry Pi 4 has been enormously popular. I think, which is a measure of the fact that people are using it to do rather heavier weight operations. A lot of people are using it in servers now.
All this machine learning stuff.
Yeah, that's it, right? And those things are memory intensive. People are running 64-bit operating systems on them, and so it could be that we find that people. It could be that 8 gig would be a useful thing. I don't think it's something we're going to do in the near term, but it's definitely something we could do. There's no technical reason we couldn't do it.
Yeah, someone else asks what about an M2 key slot for SSD? But I'm guessing that's much the same kind of answer.
Yes. So we don't have a spare PCI Express channel to connect a. If we had a spare PCI Express channel, part of me I think might not even do M2. Or what I might do is you can get soldered down BGA SSDs, NVMe BGA SSDs from some vendors, and it'd be kind of fun to have an option which had, it'd be another SKU variant. It'd be fun to have an option that had a soldered down SSD or an M2 or an M2 slot. M2 could be a little bit problematic because some of its power requirements is actually quite hard to make. You can make a thing that looks like M2, but it's actually quite onerous to make a compliant M2 that supplies, that meets the voltage and current requirements for babies. And that's my son kid, who is 6 months old on
Congratulations.
Saturday. Yeah, thank you.
I think last time we talked, you only had one on the way.
Yeah, no, so
amazing.
Yeah, kept us busy. Yeah, I was in Japan or something, brought over with us.
Oh, something like that.
A long time ago. So it would be interesting to do that if we had more PCI Express lanes. I think we could add a PCI Express switch if we and then share PCI Express.
We're getting some
USB
a little bit of noise there.
A little bit of noise.
It feels like something brushing the microphone. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
There we go.
Are we okay?
Yeah,
I don't
better
know where
now.
the
Thanks.
mics are. It's my new computer. I don't know where the mics are.
Technology.
So we could do that, but it didn't feel like a priority. Of course, you can attach a USB 3 mass storage device, and actually, in practice, the Delta. We found this with the compute module, which people can attach because it has an exposed PCI Express lane. We have attached NVMe devices to it, and it's a relatively modest delta. It's a kind of a 10% delta between the performance you get out of USB 3 over PCI Express and the performance you get out of a native NVMe device. So that's probably the answer: is stick a PCI Express into that. We could have, of course, retained one of the USBs internally inside the design. We did think about doing that, but it felt like it was on balance better to bring it out to the outside world. There isn't a vast amount of space. Once you've got the heatsink in there, there's not a vast amount of space left inside the device either.
Right. Yeah. So all those slots would probably have to be kind of underneath that heatsink, or just like sort of.
You probably trim it if you want to do that. You probably trim the heatsink laterally, and you probably could actually. I think when I say. Could the heatsink be smaller? The heat spreader could probably be smaller, a little bit smaller. You'd start to eat into overclock margin, though, so you'd start to eat into people's ability to run it at, I think, 2.2. A lot of people are running about 2.2 gig, and you might well limit your ability to get up to those kind of frequencies without throttling.
For sure. So it seems like a lot of these questions about customizations are things that the community might just handle on its own. Like, for example, you mentioned that, this kind of Raspberry Pi inside of a keyboard sort of single unit thing was done a few years ago by a hobbyist, and you expect to see someone doing this with like a Model M or whatever fancy keyboard. Similarly, it seems like a lot of these questions around like, could you add this, could you add that, it'll probably either be addressed by someone else or you could do it yourself.
But people used to do this with when we released the keyboard, because of course we released the keyboard so we could do this product. And there was we had a horrible year of people putting 3 A pluses and zeros inside the keyboard, thinking, nobody guessed what we're planning, nobody guessed what we're planning, nobody guessed what we're planning. And nobody did.
Zero especially.
Yeah, right. And nobody did. So but we had our hearts in our mouths a little bit. So when we opened up Hackster, we saw, we see a project. And
yeah, there are, and the community has come up with other forms of Raspberry Pi computers. You've got the Raspad, you've got the Pi Top, you've got, this one where someone was building it into a TI-92 calculator, which is the first time I learned to do the little type-in programs and stuff, where in the manual they had little apps. It was actually
calculators are fascinating, right? Because they were kind of the last bastion of what I would consider my childhood of type-in programming. Calculators of various sorts, particularly the TI ones, became kind of the last bastion. So by the time I was recruiting people to the University of Cambridge in about 2004, 2005, some of the people I was admitting had learned to program on calculators in the same way that I'd learned to program on a BBC Micro. We have a guy who works for us, at Raspberry Pi who learned to program on the Nintendo DS
Wow.
using a bootleg cartridge, basic cartridge
Wow.
from out of Hong Kong, using using a stylus and a soft keyboard on the bottom screen to type in every character.
Wow.
He's
And
amazing.
you do
He's an amazing engineer.
yeah, and you do
you've
have
got to
these
want it, right?
for sure. Oh yeah, and you do have like ways for people to learn from the ground up on here. You've got, you know, Scratch, you've got the Python stuff, and you've got Sonic Pi, all kinds of different ways that people can get started from the very, very beginning all the way up to, you know, everything that you can do on a regular computer, which is amazing.
Yeah, and it's really important, right? It's important that you don't have, you don't try to prescribe the tools that people use. So I love BASIC, and then 6502 assembly language, which I still enjoy.
And there's even Minecraft.
Programming in.
Yeah.
Yes. And then I did 68,000 assembly language on the Amiga. But there are some people for whom music is going to be the way in. There are some people for whom Minecraft is going to be the way in. There are some people for whom Python, which is probably as close to my experience as a child, will be the way in, or Scratch. And it's important that you don't try to like force people into one model. Or one model of programming, or one set of objectives. So I used to love to play games, and I used to love to program games. And probably when I started Raspberry Pi, my thinking was mostly around games. There's a GPIO connector on there. I didn't want to put a GPIO connector on there. That was Pete Lomas, my co-founder, who's an electric. He's more of a, if I'm software, he's more electronics, hardware. And he said, well, look, you've got these pins on the SoC, bring them out to the now infamous 26-pin Raspberry Pi connector, of which the 40-pin connector is an extended version. And of course, it turns out that the majority of the, when we look at people applying to study computing at Cambridge, they all say that they got their start using Raspberry Pi, but they also say that what they got their start doing was robotics, mostly. It was physical computing rather than software. So if I'd allowed my preconception about what people would do with Raspberry Pis to be dominated by what I'd done as a child, then I don't think we would have had anything like the impact that we have because of Pete's work.
Amazing. I'm really curious about what was so infamous about the 23-pin connector, but I'll have to look at
the 26-pin connector. It has infamous. It has the pins in a funny order. They're kind of in the order that it's an interesting example of setting a standard setting, right? This idea of like railway, the wheels on railway wagons are the distance, the width apart they are because
of the Roman wagons,
because of Roman wagons, right? All the way back, and it's that thing where if you create a standard, they're very sticky, and so the pins on that connector come out in kind of the order which was given the limited PCB technology that we had at the time, the order which was convenient to get them out from the Broadcom SoC. And then, of course, over time, it becomes a standard. Even when we did, when James Adams did 1B Plus in 2014 and wanted to do more GPIO, it wasn't really, even by that point. People talk about the Arduino, the funny kink where the Arduino pins,
the way the
Arduino pins, they're not on a 0.1 inch grid. And I think I remember seeing an interview with Massimo probably talking about how they kind of realized that very early on, but they had made 1,000 Arduinos. We can't change. We made 1,000 Arduinos.
1,000.
Yeah, there's a famous bug in C. The operator precedence for bitwise and a bitwise OR in C are not sticky enough. They have too low a precedence. So they have the, is that right? Or is it the other way around? Is it the logical ones have too higher? The logical ones, that's it. The logical ones have too high a precedence. The logical ones have the same precedence as the bitwise ones. And it means that if you write, if A equals B and C equals D, you have to put brackets around the equals, otherwise the and becomes sticky and sticks the B and the C, sticks the B and the C together. And various other subsequent languages have fixed this. But so if you look at Python, and has a very different precedence from ampersand. But the story is, I don't know if this is true, that C but they'd written thousands of lines of C by the time they realised that this was becoming. But this is a common thing that people hate about our language. People like, but we've written we're AT&T. We've written 10,000 lines of the Unix code now. We can't change it now.
10,000 lines.
And so it was like that. So
you can't change it now.
We couldn't change it now, and of course we had sold a few Raspberry Pis. We sold about 2.5 million Raspberry Pis. But there was no way out of even once we had a high level of USB technology, and nominally it would be nice to reshuffle that connector. There was no way to reshuffle it without causing an enormous amount of pain, destroying an enormous amount of value in the community. And of course, then what you start to see is other people. This connector is infamous because you start to see it show up in places. I remember going to a company called Newell, who became by Huawei, and they became the people who made NB-IoT, the radio that became the narrowband IoT.
Oh yeah.
Standard. They had their first SoC came back, and I went around to see them, and they had this little dev kit for their first SoC, and I had this 26-pin connector on it. And I'm like, guys, we use our 26-pin connector standard. No, it's great. Everyone uses it now. I'm like,
that's terrifying. Being followed around by your old.
Yeah. That's infamous. I mean, I think it's been successful.
Now people know what to dress as for
with
Halloween.
With an unlimited amount of PCB tech early on, I don't think it's probably.
So I want to be conscious of your time. We only have a couple of minutes, and we do have some more questions, but I don't think we'll have time for them. Sorry, folks, but
Come on, let's do it quickly. Come on,
Okay.
Quick and non-verbose.
Okay, cool. We have more questions about, let's see, for the Compute Module 4, can we have a little board with the same form factor attached in the bottom for accessing GPIO and other stuff? Because the board, I think it's like a carrier board. They want a smaller carrier board.
The community will make these boards.
I think that makes sense. Our friend says, I could just listen to Evan's stories all day. Can we make this a weekly thing? Probably not, but anytime you want to come on.
Subject you all to 30 years of, when I was a lad. I did actually say we made our entertainment, didn't I? I mean, I didn't quite say we made it by eating coal or something. But,
you can read Eben's blog posts on the Raspberry Pi blog. There's a number of cool ones. There's this one about the Usborne books. You've got this one about learning to write games for the BBC Micro and things like that. So there's more Eben, but of course, anytime you would like to join, you're totally welcome.
And if I could plug a Twitter account,
for sure.
That I've occasionally, I mentioned 652 assembly language at BBC Microbot. Microbot. Are you aware of this?
It's amazing.
You tweeted the basic program and it runs it and then sends you a video of it running on. This is it, BBC Microboot, and there's a wonderful video of all of these different things people have been able to do in 280 characters. Some quite amazing. So some amazing stuff. I've had some fun with this in the past. So really follow this account if you want it. If you want your daily dose of, oh my god, 8-bit computers can do that, and they can do it in 280 characters, then this account is your friend.
And some people use little cheats, it seems, like different character sets in order to fit extra.
Yeah, I'm a purist. There was a poll, and I voted one way. But look at this ray tracing, right? See,
like this one. But you look at the code for that, and it's like this.
Yeah. I'm a purist, and I don't believe that is there. But I was outvoted.
Well, there you go, everyone. You can check out BBC Microbot. Fantastic. Is there anything you'd like to throw in there before we wrap up here?
I don't think so. I'm really pleased. We've had a great couple of days. It's always nice. Things like the launch of Raspberry 400 are an opportunity to reconnect with the community, and to sort of kind of see, enormous amounts of work happens behind the scenes, and then lots of our products are conviction products. They're products. They're not products that a focus group told us to go and make. Nobody told us to go and make an homage to the computers of the 1980s in the way that Martin has done with Pi 400. So it's always an opportunity to reconnect with the community and meet old friends and find out what they like and what they don't like, find out what we did right and what we did wrong. So this is just these weeks are the weeks I live for, really, and it's wonderful to be doing it. And I'm super grateful that you carved out an hour of your time to chat.
Oh my goodness!
I will not inflict it on you every week, but thank you very much.
I wouldn't complain. It's amazing, and thank you so much for dealing with our technical difficulties. Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us.
how is Archimedes?
Oh, Archimedes is great. He's back there.
Archimedes as well. Okay, good. That's all right.
Someone asked about a Pi 400 and Archimedes collaboration. I feel like actually, the latest, the new companion robot Fenrir here has a. Oh boy, his paw is stuck to his face. Has a Raspberry Pi down there inside. I think that's going to be a Pi 4, but right now it's a 3 Model B with like a neural compute stick too and some extra jazz.
Wow.
But yeah, probably this guy is going to be more in the Raspberry Pi happening times. Oh boy, I'm dropping all my things. It's probably time for me to wrap up and get some coffee. Thank you so much for joining us. Oh, what a pleasure. And we'll see you soon.
Good night and good luck.
Thanks. And congratulations. See ya.
Bye.